everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with the this keyword in JavaScript together. In the previous video, we looked at the this keyword in a bit of depth and the main concepts behind it. We kind of saw how it also works a little bit with the prototypes and the prototype chain as well as the new keyword. This is meant to be a bunch of extra practice if you really want to help understand what the this keyword is doing and how the context for the this is actually set up in different things like objects and functions and things like that. We are going to also go over a couple of bonus exercises in this video. I was really excited putting these exercises together, and I really think this is a pretty fundamental concept to actually the next step as we go through JavaScript together, which is object-oriented programming and classes and the class syntax that's been introduced recently in the language. So in order to really understand that, the bonus exercises here are definitely quite challenging and set up for us in such a way that we can actually move on to object-oriented programming, knowing that that's actually what's happening behind the scenes. So enough about that. Let's actually get to the exercises together. Okay, so as with the previous exercises, I kind of have all of these set up on the GitHub repo, so feel free to grab that from the description and just either get it from the website or you can clone it down and follow along. But I'm going to go through each of these comments basically in each of the files. I'll kind of give a bit of preamble for each one. I'll give you a chance to pause the video and try it yourself, and then we'll go through a potential solution together. Okay, so for this warm-up exercise, I would like you to create a object that's called pet, right? So send it to a variable called pet, and that object looks like this right here. So it has a name property that is pointing to Nemo, a type property that's pointing to fish, and an age property pointing to 2. Then what we want to do is we want to add a say hello function or method to the object prototype. Okay, so be careful with this, right? Read this carefully. This is adding it to the prototype, not this instance of pet. Well, when called, what it should do is it should log out the object's name, type, and age. For example, if we were to call it with this pet object, as just one particular example, we could have many pets, it would log out something that looks like this. It would be Nemo is a fish and is 2 years old. Nemo says hi. All right. So if I create a different type of object that is another pet that has a name, type, and age, and I call the say hello function on it, it should do the same thing. Okay, so it would look like this if we called it with the pet object here. We could say pet.sayHello. And again, be careful, this is not on the actual object itself. I'm repeating that on purpose just so you don't try to do it that way. We want to make sure this is on the prototype of object in general. What we want to then do is make another pet object very similar to this one with the same properties, and make sure that we can do kind of that pet.sayHello, and it works the exact same way, and it actually uses the prototype. So give that a shot, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so this one is a bit tricky, so you might actually need to understand how prototypes work as well as the this keyword for this one to actually works. To make sense, we're actually going through both of these concepts kind of in conjunction in this video, because a lot of the time they are really tied together, at least when it comes to the chaining of the prototypes and methods and things like that. And it really does set us up nicely for object-oriented programming, because they really do kind of work hand in hand a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time. Okay, so let's do this. Let's do const pet. And I'm just going to copy this object right here. And you can, again, grab this from the repo if you don't want to sit there and type it out. Some of the later ones are a bit longer in the next exercises. Then what we want to do is we want to add a say hello function to the object prototype. Okay, so you have to be careful with this, because what we don't want to do, and I know I've emphasized this enough already, we don't want to do this, right? We don't want to say hello is equal to a function, and then like it does whatever it does over here, right? We don't want to do this, okay? Because what we're doing here is we're adding say hello to the instance of pet. It will not exist on other pets that we create unless we copy and paste it over, which is the entire point of this. We're not trying to duplicate code. We want to make sure this is on the prototype. So I'm going to delete that. And I've mentioned that this is going to be on the object prototype. Now, another kind of word of warning here is generally you don't modify the object prototype. We're just doing this for learning purposes in this particular set of exercises, and we'll actually see how we can avoid this with custom objects shortly. So what we want to do is we want to do object.prototype, Okay, so on the prototype key, which is pointing to the prototype of object in this case, we want to add the say hello function. And remember, we have to use the function keyword for this in JavaScript. We cannot use arrow functions because arrow functions do not bind the this keyword. Only regular functions allow the binding of the this keyword. If that seems confusing to you, definitely recap the previous video where I have some illustrations and visualizations to make sure that that actually makes sense when I talk about the context and binding of the this keyword. Okay, so inside of this function, since it's a function keyword, we can technically have access to the this context. So depending on how this function is actually called, but generally speaking, we can use the this context in here. So what does that mean? Well, we can kind of assume that we have this in here. And I mentioned I want to be able to log this. So I'm just going to kind of pull this into here. I'm actually going to get rid of the quotes there. I'm going to copy and paste that over here. So Nemo is specific. We want to get rid of Nemo. So I'm going to kind of replace that with a template. Fish is also specific. So I'm going to replace that with a template. 2 years old, that's specific. So I'm going to replace that with a template. And Nemo, again, as we saw, is the name, which I'm going to replace with a template. So inside of here, well, what are these slots? Well, this can be called with different pet objects. So how do we know the value of the particular pet object? Well, we can't really do this, right? We can't do pet.name because this is only going to refer to this pet object. So even if we were to call it with other pet objects, it would just always log Nemo in this case, which is not what we want. So we have to make sure that this thing before the dot is slightly different. And that's where the this keyword comes in, right? This is going to bind to whatever object we actually call this function with at runtime. So in this case, I'm going to say this dot type. Forgot what my sentence is supposed to say. This is this dot age, and then this is this dot name. I know I'm going a bit off the screen there, so I'm just going to move this down here just like that. Okay, this is going to put it on separate lines, but it should be okay for our purposes, just so you can actually read what it says. Now, let's just see if this actually works. So I'm going to pull up my terminal here. I'm going to run node. I'm going to first I'll make sure I'm in the right folder here. I'm doing ls, and I am. I'm going to run a node, and I'll do warmup exercise. And of course, I didn't actually call my function. I always do that every single time. We want to be able to say pet.sayHello. And I'll explain this in a second, but let's just see if this actually even works. And it seems to work, right? So the spacing is a bit weird because in a template string like this with the backticks, it preserves the spacing, but that's kind of good enough for our purposes, just at least for this video, so you can actually read what it says. So what is happening here, right? Before we actually add this last step, which is step 3, what can we say is happening? Well, we have an object called pet. Just a regular, plain old vanilla JavaScript object, right? It has 3 properties: name, type, and age. Name is a string, type is a string, and age is a number in this case. What we're doing is we're adding to the object's prototype. This is for every single object in JavaScript, which is pretty much everything, a say hello function or method in this case, where if we call it, we're going to do this stuff in here, which is just log out something in this case. The special thing about this is that this is a regular function instead of an arrow function, and we are able to use this in here, which is going to bind to the object that we pass this method to, or that we call this method on, I should say. So in this case, if we look at line 30, we're calling the say hello method, but we are binding it to the pet object, which is the thing before the dot. So pet is going to become the context for this inside of here, and we're actually going to be able to access this .name, this .type, and this .age. So this becomes useful when we have other pets that have different names, different types, and ages. Before I go there, I just want to mention or show you what this value actually is, right? So what is this, right? What is this actually? So if I clear my console here and I do this, we'll see that we actually get Nemo in this case, right? This I know is not part of the exercise, but just to make it a bit more clear, I will leave that in there. Now, let's create another pet. I will maybe do, I'll just copy of this over here and I'll paste it down here. I'll just call this pet2, for example. I will call, my name is Abu. I shouldn't have a pet monkey, but let's just go with that for now. Monkey, I don't know how old Abu is. Let's just say Abu is 5. Okay. And now the cool thing here is that this is an object. This is also an object. They share the fact that they have the same property names, but they have different property values, right? So the keys are the same, but the values are different. So we can actually do this. We can do pet2 dot say hello. Okay, I'd like you to think, what is this going to log out before I actually run this code? Okay, let's take a look. So there we go, right? So we get Abu is a monkey and is 5 years old, and Abu says hi. That's pretty awesome, right? And you can see that this context is shifts to Abu, right? Because that's the thing on the left-hand side of the dot in this case, which is what's set up for the context for the say hello method. Okay, perfect. So we only wrote this method once, and we can reuse it for all of our different pets. Pretty cool. Let's take a look at exercise 1. All right, perfect. So let's take a look at this one. For this exercise, there's definitely quite a bit of kind of code setup we have here. You can see that we have quite an object set up right here. So if you don't want to type this out, you definitely can pause the video and kind of type this out, and that's fine. It shouldn't take too long. But if you don't want to do that, feel free to grab it from the GitHub repo again in the description. You can either go there and actually just copy and paste it. If you scroll down to kind of this video and this set of exercises, exercise 1, you can either just copy and paste it directly out of GitHub and get some practice with GitHub like that. Or if you know how to use Git, you can actually clone down this set of exercises, and then you can get access to this content if you don't want to type it out. So just to make it a bit faster for you. So what do we want to do here? Well, we want to set up an object, and we want to call it book. And this is going to look like this, right? This object right here. One of my favorite books. I guess I didn't specify which Harry Potter, but I guess all of them. So this book is going to be called Harry Potter. Author is J.K. Rowling. We have a characters key, which is pointing to an object, right? This object right here. And inside of this object, we have main characters, which is pointing to this array of strings, Harry, Ron, and Hermione. And then we have a list, which is a function, right? And this function is going to loop over this dot main characters and console log out each character. Okay, so the interesting thing about this is that we are using this keyword right here, right? So we're looping over this dot main characters. And remember that this only gets set up when we actually give it a context to run from. So technically, just by looking at this object, we don't really know how this is going to be used. Okay, so what we want to do once we've set up this object is we want to call the list function on this book and explain the behavior, right? So you'd want to make sure to go to characters on this book and then call this list function, observe the output, see if you can predict the output before you actually run it, and see what this context is going to be, and then see if you can get that working. But the interesting part about this is what comes after. Once you have that working, what I would like you to do is kind of ask yourself the question, how would you make this list method temporarily, right? Not permanently, just temporarily log out this array instead, right? So this array of Draco, Severus, and Voldemort, right? He who shall not be named. So make sure that this is temporary, right? This is one of the keywords right here. Now, I would like you to do this without modifying the list function, right? So the hint for this is that I would like you to modify this context to be this, to have this array inside of it, so that when it loops through this dot main characters, this is actually referring to something that will refer to this, right? A lot of this in there, but hopefully that makes sense, right? So don't modify the function, and make sure this only is temporary so that you can still log out Harry, Ron, and Hermione like normal with your other function call. And the hint is, what methods can we use on functions to manipulate this context? Okay, we covered this in the previous video, but definitely think about, there's 3 in particular. You can really use, I guess, technically 2 in this case. Okay, so give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. All right, so let's just set this up first. So I'm going to say const book, and I'll just copy this so I don't have to type it out again. And that's our book right there. Perfect, looks good. Then we want to call the list function on the book and explain the behavior. Okay, so let's see how we do this. We're going to say book, and then book has characters in it. So we're going to say dot characters, and then characters has a list method in it, right? So dot list, and this is a function, so we can call the function. So before we run this, the question really is, what is this, right? In the context of running this code right here, I keep saying this. It's always it's really hard to not laugh when I am trying to explain this keyword in JavaScript. But what really is this when we are calling list in this way? Okay. So I'm going to run it and then I'll explain it in a second. So I'll do node exercise 1, and we get Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Okay. So you might have predicted this, right? So the real kind of trick is, why is this happening, right? It is not happening because it's inside the book object. Okay, that's not why it's happening. It's also not happening because it's inside the characters object. Remember, this is only bound later when we actually call the method because it's dynamic. Whatever comes before the dots, generally speaking, is what's going to be bound to the this inside of a function. So let's take a look at how it's called. So we're calling it using book.characters.list. Okay, so the thing before the dot on the list method is characters. So characters is going to be the context for this when we actually call list. So this is going to be characters. And what is characters? Well, it's this thing right here, right? So it's going to be using this set of main characters, which is why we see Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Now, what we want to do is we want to see if we can log out Draco, Severus, and Voldemort by changing the this context. So we want to actually call the same method, list, but with a different object so that we can use it as a this context instead. So I'm actually going to set up that object. Notice we're not actually using name and author. Okay, that's mainly just for us to know kind of which universe that we're living in when we're talking about these characters. But what I'm going to say is I'm going to create a, I'll just create another book, maybe book 2. And inside of book 2, I'm going to create a characters. We don't have to do it this way. This is probably just hopefully a little bit more clear when we actually do this. So I'm going to say dot main characters, and main characters is going to be this list instead. Okay. Now I don't actually need this book 2, so I'll show you what that would look like if we didn't have book 2. We technically only need this characters object right here. Okay, we don't even need to have it really be called characters. We can just pass this object directly. So I'll show you all these options in a second. But to really kind of hammer this home, let's just start with a simple case. We're going to call book 2 dot characters dot main characters, and then we're going to call dot list. Right? Now, if you look at this, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, this is not going to work, right? Because if I have a book 2, that's this one, characters, main characters, list. Well, there is no list on this, right? So if I run this, we're going to get there's no list function. It's not a function on book 2. Okay, so how do we kind of go about this, right? So this is probably one thing you might have thought of. Well, what we really want to do is we want to call the book list method, but in kind of this context, we just want to change the context a little bit. Okay, so we already have this book set up. We already have the list function set up. We just need to call it. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to comment that out for now. I'm going to just use the regular book, and I'm going to say dot characters dot list, because that's where my function is. But I don't want to call this function, because if I call it, I'm going to end up doing this, which is on line 39. And I don't want to set the this context to be this characters right here, right? So I want to do dot call, which is the special keyword that we need to take it into account here, which is allows us to actually set up the this object for this function call, right? So if I give it book 2, let's see what we get. So I'm going to clear out my console just so you can actually see this, and you can see that we don't actually we get an error again, right? So it's saying that this dot main characters is not iterable. So this is definitely another error that we're going to potentially run into if you did it this way. So the reason for this is that we are actually setting up the context to be book 2, right? And book 2 doesn't have a main characters on it, right? So if I actually console.log out this, what we'll see is that it's going to be undefined in the context of book 2. Okay. So where is it? Right here. So we're going to get, this is for book 1. And we're going to get Harry, Ron, and Hermione. This is for book 2. And you can see that it's logging out the entire this object. And I meant to say that this.main_characters is undefined, right? Because if you look at this, we're logging out this right here on line 32. This formatting is a little bit hard to see, but hopefully you can kind of make it out. It's the same thing as what we have on book 2. There is no main characters at the root level of this object. It's actually within the characters object, this one right here, right? So we need to actually pass it in as if it's kind of at the root level, because that's what's using for the context, because it's using this dot main characters, but this dot main characters is actually not there. It's this dot characters dot main characters that we're interested in. So we can kind of fix this in 2 ways. I want to show you both because this is a really useful exercise. I can technically copy this line, right? And I can put this here. And now what if I do this? It will actually work, right? Because now this is on, or the main characters is on the main this object, right? It's at the root level. It's not hidden within characters. So that looks kind of not great. So if I got rid of that, what we could technically do is we could call it with book2.characters like this, which is a little bit cleaner because it follows the same format. And you can see that in this case, we are passing in this object right here, which is an object that has a main character's key and a value of an array, which is exactly what this .main_characters is looking for, right? So this is this object, .main_characters is this looking for this key, and it's going to grab this value. Okay, definitely a little bit confusing, but hopefully going through that makes a little bit of sense. What I'd really like to eventually turn this into is I can also call it like this. So I guess I'll actually leave this here, and I'll just copy this line, and I'll get rid of book2.characters here. And you can see that we don't even need to create this object like this. I can just pass it in directly right here. I don't need characters, and I don't need that. So I can actually pass in an object that just has a main character's key, as long as that is what's becoming of the this context, which is what we're telling it to do with the call method, right? So in this case, we get the exact same result that we have on line 50. Okay, so definitely a few different ways and a few different areas you might run into. I purposely kind of went through all those just so it helps you a little bit, and you can actually see the manipulation of the this context and what the value this actually ends up being when we actually call these functions from different contexts. So call is definitely an important one to know. You might have also used apply, in which case, in this case, it wouldn't actually make a difference because this function doesn't actually take any arguments. So if I actually change this to apply, what you'll see is that this will actually do the same thing, because the only difference with apply and call is how we use the second or more parameters, which is either an array of arguments or a comma-separated list of arguments. Okay, let's take a look at exercise 2. So for this one, again, I'd like you to use the same object just so you're not doing too much copying and pasting around here, because the main lesson for this one is kind of the same context but slightly different, no pun intended. I'd like you to create the same book object, right? So Harry Potter is a name, author of J.K. Rowling, characters, main characters, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, list, which is a function which loops through all the main characters and logs them out. But what I want you to like to do this time is, instead of making it temporary, just using the call, I want to actually make it permanent, right? So let me just show you what I mean. If I come back here, and after this call or apply, I actually call the book.characters.list function again, what we'll see is that it actually uses Harry, Ron, and Hermione still. Right? So I'm using Harry, Ron, and Hermione, then I'm calling it in the context of this main characters, Draco, Severus, Voldemort, then I'm calling it again in the context of characters, which is book.characters, and I'm getting Harry, Ron, and Hermione again. Right? So it was just temporary. This apply is only for that function call. But what I want to do in this exercise is make it permanent. Okay? So I would like you to make it so that when we call book.characters.list, right? So using the original book object, we actually log out Draco, Severus, and Voldemort instead. Now, I want you to do this with a couple of caveats. The easiest way to do this, as you can probably imagine, is just to change this function and change the main characters, right? So don't do that for this exercise. This is meant to show you something different. So you're not allowed to change main characters, and you're also not allowed to change a list directly, like inside this function call. You shouldn't be like logging them out manually, for example, right? The way I want you to do this is think about how you would change the context for this inside of list, but change it permanently so that even if I call book.characters.list, it doesn't log out Harry, Ron, and Hermione anymore. It logs out Draco, Severus, and Voldemort. So same kind of concept as what we looked at before. Give it a shot. Try to think about what the method might be on functions that can change the this context, but permanently this time, and give that a shot, and we'll go through a solution together. Okay, so for this one, I'm just going to say const book. I'm going to set up the same object right here. There we go. And now we want to make it so that we are logging out Draco, Severus, and Voldemort. So I'll just copy that. Just to make sure this works, I'm going to say book.list. Book.characters.list. That's what we want to call. I'm just going to make sure this runs correctly. Didn't make any mistakes. Node exercise 2. There we go, Harry, Ron, and Hermione. And you know what? I'll just console.log out this. I know I said don't modify this, but just for the purpose of this video, just so you can really kind of see what this character is. I'll put this out here, not inside the loop, just so that we can see it one time at the start. So this is main characters, and we have the two things in there because that's what characters is, right? So this context for this function call in line 41 is this object right here, which is characters, which is what we're seeing in our console. So now we want to change this permanently. So the main thing for this is the keyword bind, which we can use with functions very similar to how we use call and apply. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways to do this. So I'm going to say const, and I'll say new list, or I'll say actually bound list function. And this is equal to, I'm going to take the list inside of book.characters.list, and I'm going to bind it, right, to a different this context. Which this context am I going to bind it to? Well, I'm going to bind it to an object that has a main characters property of Draco, Severus, and Voldemort, right? Because as long as we have a main characters property, this.main characters is going to be defined inside of this context for list, and it will actually loop through it and log out all those values, just as we saw in exercise 1. Now, check this out. If I literally just call bound list function, right, it's already bound to this entire thing. Let's see what we get. So we get this, which is this object, which we just created, right, which we passed in here between line 43 and 44, Draco, Severus, and Voldemort, but tied to a main character's key inside of an object. But we get Draco, Severus, and Voldemort, right? So no matter how many times I call this function, what we'll see is it's just going to keep, it's stuck with that as a this context. Now, this doesn't really solve our problem because this is a totally different function. Right? So if I actually get rid of one of these and I take this list right here and I copy it down here, what we'll see is that it's still referring to Harry, Ron, and Hermione, right? So it only exists in the context of Draco, Severus, and Voldemort when I'm binding it as this variable. But what we can do is we can actually reassign the list variable inside of book to now refer to this bound function instead. So I can say book.characters.list is equal to whatever comes back from this bind function, which is the function that is bound to this value of this object right here. Now this bound function doesn't exist anymore, so I'm just going to comment that out. And what we'll see is now the list here is going to be Harry, Ron, and Hermione. But when we call it again, after we've rebound it here to this object, and reassign it back into the same book object with the characters object, we're not going to get Harry, Ron, and Hermione here. We're going to get Draco, Severus, and Voldemort. So check it out. We indeed do. Isn't that super cool, right? You can even see that this value is slightly different, right? Because we didn't add the list function inside of the function call for the bind, right? Or inside the object we're binding to, I should say. We only have the array, which is what it needs, because the list function already exists inside of here. Okay, definitely pretty cool. All right, hopefully that gives you a good understanding of how the this keyword and context are bound to each other, as well as the call, apply, and bind methods themselves. Let's take a look at exercise 3. Okay, so for this one, we are going to start using function and some of the new keywords that we actually looked at. So for this, I would like you to create a function called person, and it's going to have 3 parameters, okay? Name, age, and favorite food. Now, keep in mind, I would like you to use the function keyword, right? I'm going to keep reiterating that because arrow functions do not allow us to bind a this value. These have to be regular function keywords, okay? Also, the convention for something that looks like this is going to be a capital for the function name instead of the lowercase like we normally do with our arrow functions, okay? Which we'll see come into play when we also look at classes in the next video. Now, inside the person, I'd like you to directly do these things. This is going to look kind of weird if you haven't seen it before, but this is not any function calls or anything like that, and we're not returning anything from this function at all either. I would just like you to say this.name equals name, this.age equals age, and this.favorite food equals favorite food, which are the arguments that are going to be passed into this function. Okay, so no return value, just these 3 lines. Then I'd like you to create these 2 variables right here. Now, notice there is a slight difference between them apart from the arguments that we're passing in. I'd like you to create const Avery, which is going to be person, Avery 20 dark chocolate, right? And const Jackie, which is going to be a new person, Jackie 35 and sourdough bread, okay? So the only main difference between their values is this new keyword. All right, now I'd like you to log out Avery and Jackie and see if what you see makes sense. Then I'd like you to log out the entire prototype chain of Jackie to see what you actually get. All right, and I'd like you to explain what you might think is happening behind the scenes with this new operator versus not using the new operator when we're using this in JavaScript. So definitely a lot more involved, a lot more thinking for this one, a bit more abstract. This is really set up to help you understand the this value, the this context, as well as prototypes in JavaScript. So take your time with this one and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's start by creating a function. This is going to be called person. And this function is going to have a name, age, and favorite food. Right, so I'm going to name, age, and favorite food. Perfect. And make sure not to have an arrow function, so we did that. Perfect. Now inside of person, we want to set the values directly. So we want to say this.name is equal to the name that we pass in. Now notice these are 2 different things. This is an object, right? And we are setting the name property to be the name that we pass it as an argument. Okay, so this, just imagine it's an object, all right? It is not the same thing as the thing on the right. Same thing for age, this.favorite food. So we're basically copying these values into the this object. Okay, I'm setting up some hints here for us. And no return value, so that's perfect. So then what we want to do is these 2 variables. I'm just going to copy these to save some time. And I want to log out Avery and Jackie. So I'm going to say console.logout Avery, which was without the new keyword. And then I want to log out Jackie, which was with the new keyword. Okay, so I'm going to run node, exercise3.js. And now this is pretty interesting, right? So for Avery, we get undefined, which is interesting, curious. For Jackie, we get person, and it seems to have all the things that we passed it. So what on earth is person, right? What is this, right? And why is Avery undefined? Okay, so let's talk about Avery first. All right, so if you think about this function, just if you pretend you didn't know anything about this, and I told you that this is just the name of an object. Okay, like imagine I just said const like obj is equal to this, right? This object. Then I just did this a bunch of times. Oops, got too excited with my, I just did this a bunch of times, right? Imagine that we did this, right? There's nothing special really going on here. There is no return value for this function. And we know that when we don't return anything from a function, JavaScript returns undefined by default. So that is why we're seeing undefined when we don't use a new keyword and we just call this function like a regular function. Okay, it doesn't matter that we're using this inside of it, because it seems like the only time that this matters is when we're using new, or when we're trying to give it a specific context to actually apply to. Okay, so in the context of new, what seems to be happening? Well, it looks like JavaScript is creating a person object, and inside of there it has our key value pairs that we passed it. So that's kind of interesting, right? So let's take a look at this prototype chain of Jackie and see what we can get. So I'm going to say console.log Jackie dot, and then we can do either object dot get prototype of, or we can just do the underscore underscore. Oh my goodness. I think I got too excited with my key bindings there. Proto. And that's going to go to the prototype of Jackie. And if we do that, it looks like we kind of just get this thing. So what is this thing? Well, we'll kind of come back to that in a second. So that doesn't seem to be null yet, so that's okay. Let's go one level higher. So I'm going to do dot underscore underscore proto. Let's see what we get there. Okay, so now we get object null prototype, and then we're going to go one higher, and then hopefully we get to null, which is the top of the prototype chain. And let me just kind of get it so it's not behind my face. And it looks like this is a prototype chain right there, right? So it's this object thing, and then another object thing, and then null. So now if we want to log out the actual names of these, let's see how we can do that, because this right here is good. I mean, we can see that this actually shows us a little bit about the prototype chain. So it looks like there's something here before the object prototype, which is really interesting, but we don't really know what that is. We can kind of see here that maybe it's person, right? But it'd be nice to actually kind of get clarification on that. So what we can do is we can say on the prototype, there's a constructor property if it was created with a new keyword. And we can say dot name to grab the name of that thing on the constructor. So I'm going to do that for that prototype and that prototype. Not going to work for null because we can't do null dot something. So I'm going to leave that one blank. So let's take a look at what happens if I do this and take a look at that, right? We have the actual prototype chain for Jackie. We have the first prototype, which is person, which is super awesome. That's like our own custom like prototype, I guess. And then the prototype of person is object, and the prototype of object, of course, is null because that's the top of the chain. So we've effectively inserted this new prototype, which inherits from the prototype of object, all of the things in object, but also our new things, in this case, the name, age, and favorite food. So that's pretty awesome. Okay, so how do I explain what is happening here with the new keyword in JavaScript? So we can probably say that the new keyword is basically like setting up a new object and hooking up its prototype to the actual object prototype in JavaScript, but it gives us the ability to create this custom object that's one below the object in the prototype chain. We can start attaching our own properties, like in this case here, onto it that are not part of the object prototype, but part of our custom object prototype. In this case, the person prototype. Okay, so technically, there's a lot more going on in behind the scenes in this case. So for example, if I want to take a look at a couple of things here, I can say console.log Jackie or object. I think I said something a bit wrong there, so I should clarify here. Object.get own property names of Jackie, and then object of get own property names of our person in general. Let's take a look at what we get when we look at these. And we can see that Jackie has a name, age, and favorite food as its own property name. So we're basically getting back an object from person that has these values inside of it. And then the person, it looks like it's like a function kind of thing, right? It has a length, name, arguments, color, and then prototype, right? So there's a lot of interesting things in there, but this is not the object. Right? So if we were to actually look at the prototypes for these, which is what we did over here, we would see that this is a person prototype, and then object prototype, and then the null. So we're going to definitely use this knowledge going forward to actually set up very complex and interesting prototype chains, which is effectively how object-oriented programming in JavaScript specifically works using this prototype chain. But we can really say that this when used in conjunction with new, and a function is effectively returning an object to us, as we can see here, with those keys and values as part of that object, but it's also setting up the prototype of that object to, instead of being the object prototype, it is the person prototype in this case, which is our custom function, right? And then that prototype is the object prototype. We can also add static methods onto this if we want, onto the prototype directly if we want. We can do all sorts of crazy fun things with person itself, which we'll look into later. I hope that makes sense as an example of what is this keyword is doing in the context of new for a function. Now, let's take a look at these bonus exercises next. Just as a kind of pretext for these bonuses are set up to be quite complex because they are effectively doing a lot of recreating of what JavaScript does for us behind the scenes when we think about object-oriented programming. So if you really, really want to get a good handle of this keyword, I encourage you to slowly work your way through them, because the bonus exercises really focus deeply on this, as well as the prototype chain and how they work together seamlessly in order to enable a lot of really cool functionality that we see in JavaScript. Definitely more challenging, but worth a shot if you give them a chance. Let's take a look at the first bonus exercise. Okay, so for this bonus, I'm just going to clear this screen out here for us. We got a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. So this is going to be very dependent on kind of concepts and explanations and really thinking things through. Less so, there is a bit of coding, but less so about explicit coding, but there is a little bit. So we want to create these two functions. Okay, this function right here, which is a function called thisPerson. It takes a name, age, favorite food, just like we saw earlier, which is effectively just a recreation of our person function that we just wrote. And it sets all the this properties to be the things that we pass in. But then what we want to do is we want to create a function called protoPerson. Okay, and this is going to take a name, age, and favorite food as well. But the main difference is that this is going to return an object directly. Okay, so we're not going to set the this values inside of this function. We're actually going to return an object. So this part here might seem a little bit confusing as well. I'd just like to kind of go through this real quick. So this is a shorthand property initialization, which I think is like ES6. I'm not actually sure. I'll have to double check that. But effectively, you can think of this as doing this, right? Name of name, age of age, favorite food, right? So if the key and the value are the same name, right? So we're setting age key to be the age argument that we get passed in, you can actually just shorten that to be one thing because JavaScript will kind of figure out that you mean the same thing for that, right? So since these are matching, we can actually just create this object just like this. All right, so the key here though is that protoPerson is returning an object that has those key value pairs inside of it. It's not using this. Okay, so the real question here for this bonus, well, there's two real questions, but the first big question is what's the difference between these two? Okay. When I create this person using the new keyword and passing it a couple of arguments, and then creating protoPerson but without the new keyword. Okay, so I'd like you to log these out and ask yourself, what's the difference? Is there a difference between these two? Okay, and once you've kind of taken a look at that, this is probably giving you a bit of a hint for it. How would you modify this protoPerson function, right? So that it can return the same thing as the thisPerson function, but without having us to use the new keyword, right? So there is some small differences, right? But try to figure out what those differences are and see if you can modify protoPerson so that without using the new keyword, so using it in the same way, it pretty much, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but pretty much functions the same way as the new thisPerson. Okay, so the main hint here for you is that you want to think about how you'd modify and set up the prototype chain for protoPerson. Okay, specifically the instance of the object that comes back as a return value from protoPerson, right? Okay, give you a chance to try that out. This is meant to be very challenging. We'll go through it together in a second. Okay, so I'm just going to copy these two functions down here. Let me do that. And what I'd like you to do next is just kind of copy these two out, thisPerson and protoPerson, put that down here. And then I'll log them out, and I want to see what the difference is between these two instances. Okay, so I'm going to say console.log out this person, and I want to console.log out proto person as well. All right, pull up my terminal here. I'm going to run node, and this is the bonus exercise 1. And okay, so interesting, right? If we take a look at this, what you can see is that for this person, right, which is what we created with the new keyword, we get back this object. And for proto person, we get back this object. Now, of course, they have different keys and values. So that's fine, right? This is just so that we can distinguish them a little bit easier. But is there any other differences apart from kind of their name, age, and favorite food? Well, it looks like we have this person as a label for this. So what does that mean, right? What is the difference between these two? There seems to be some kind of difference, but what is this difference, right? Now, if you thought back to exercise 3 here, right, where you actually saw us use this new person syntax and what it actually does for us behind the scenes and the prototype chain, this might make a little bit more sense. Okay, so I want to show you something here. I'm going to log out the prototype chain for each of these. So I'm going to say console.log out this person dot underscore proto, and I'll do dot constructor dot name. And I'm going to do the proto again here. And I'm going to see what that is. And I'll do the same for proto person. Oops. There we go. Okay, so I'll actually get kind of console or comment these out just so that we can really look at the prototype chains for each of these. So what is the direct prototype and the prototype above the prototype for this person, and the same for proto person? All right, let's take a look. Okay, so interesting. So we can't actually go higher up on proto person. So we can say cannot read property constructor of null. So that's basically telling us that for proto person here, we are already at the null prototype. So this is already kind of getting us up to null, right? So let's take a look at this. So like if we kind of go, so proto.proto, I should say, is null. I should put that down here. And if I run this one more time, what we'll see is the two logs for this person are these two right here, right? So the immediate prototype is this person, and the prototype above this person is object. And then above that, we have null, right? And then for proto person, it looks like we immediately have object as the prototype. We don't have a like proto person in between us and object. So let's try to investigate why this is. If you take a look at this code, we know that when we call the new keyword and we have this in a function, the whole point of that in JavaScript is to kind of construct this new object and hook up the prototype to be object and give it its own prototype, which in this case is this person. But when we just return a regular object like this, this is just a regular plain old JavaScript object. There's nothing fancy about it apart from the initialization syntax if you've seen that for the first time, right? But it's just name of name, age of age, favorite food of favorite food. Okay, so name is going to be proto and age is 1, and favorite food is question mark. So we can really say that this is really no different from a regular JavaScript object. And of course, the prototype of this thing is the regular JavaScript object prototype. And we know that the prototype of the object prototype is null. Okay, so we need a way to actually set the prototype of this object to be proto person instead of object, right? So that really is the kind of trick here. So how do we kind of go about this? So let's think about this for a second. So we can set the prototype of something. We know how to do that, right? We know that we can either set the underscore proto, or we can do set prototype of. So I'm going to show you that here, what we can do, I'm going to call this const instance is equal to this. So just so I have a reference to the instance object before I actually return it right away. Now, what I want to do is I want to set the prototype of this object to be proto person, not to be object, which is what it is right now. Okay, so I can do that by saying instance dot underscore underscore proto, or we can do object dot set prototype of instance, right? But most importantly, what do I want to set the prototype to be? Because right now it's equal to the object prototype. I don't want it to be the object prototype, right? What prototype do I want it to be? Well, I want it to be the proto2person or protoperson.prototype, right? So I'm going to change that to protoperson.prototype, right? So I'm saying, please change this object's prototype to be the protoperson prototype, just like happened over here automatically for us behind the scenes when we created this person using the new keyword. Okay, and once I've changed that, then I can return that instance. Okay, so now the question is, okay, well, if we change this prototype to be this prototype, right, then what's the prototype of this thing? Is it still object? So let's find out, right? I'm going to run this code again, and look at that, right? Isn't that awesome? We have the prototype of protoperson, which is what we get back from calling this. And notice that we didn't use new. I didn't change any code in here, just the code in the function, right? We are getting back protoperson as the prototype for our protoperson. Right? Now, let's see if I can kind of console log this back or comment this back in. I don't know why I say console log this back in all the time. So now let's see what's the prototype of protoperson, right? Because previously the prototype of object was null, but is the prototype of protoperson the object prototype just like it is for this person? So fingers crossed. Ta-da! Look at that. Isn't that pretty awesome, right? We get for this person, which points to object prototype, which points to null. And for protoperson, we get protoperson, which points to the object prototype, which then points to null. Okay, so now there are some differences here and there between these two, but the real point of this is that this is really setting up the prototype chain. And when we use the new keyword behind the scenes, you can think of it as basically doing something like this, right? It's just hooking up these prototypes for us so that we actually have our own custom object that then refers to the object prototype. Okay, and this all is powerful because we can change the prototype of something before we actually return it if we want, away from something like the object prototype. Okay, I hope that was a fun one for you. Perfect. So let's check out exercise 2. So this one is equally kind of gnarly, so definitely take your time with it, but you will learn a lot doing this, even if you just attempt it and even if you don't get it right away. So what I'd like you to do for this one is create the following function. I should say following one function. Following function. Okay. Then inside this function, it's going to be a person, just like before. We have name, age, and favorite food. And we're just going to set that up just like we did previously, right? So this.name is name, this.age is age, and this.favorite food is favorite food. Then we want to add the following to the person prototype. Okay, and we kind of saw this, for example, where was it? Was it exercise 1 or was it it was the warm up, right? Just like we had the object prototype, we added say hello. What we want to do is we want to add to the person prototype, which is what we just created right here, the greet function, right? And greet is just going to log out this.name says hello. Okay. Then what we want to do is we want to create another function. I guess that's why I had 2 functions, but that was a bit confusing. We want to create another function, and this function is called superhero. I got my numbering wrong here as well. Lots of little mistakes. I apologize. I think I got too excited making these instructions. We want to create another function called superhero, and it has the same 3 parameters as person, but it also has a 4th parameter called overpowered. Okay, so it's going to have name, age, favorite food, and then comma overpowered. Okay, and the name is not going to be person, it's going to be called superhero. So inside the superhero function, we want to set up all the properties on this object, this just like we did in person, but we also want to add the overpowered. So we're going to do this overpowered is equal to overpowered. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to set the prototype of superhero to be person. Okay. Now, this can technically be done a couple of ways. I'll leave it up to you. But once we've done that, what I'd like you to do is create an instance of person and then create an instance of superhero like so, right? So we have const like Anya, for example, is equal to a new person, Anya. Anya's 40, and Anya loves sour keys. Okay, and then we can create Batman. I think I should probably add overpowered is Batman is definitely not overpowered, so I'm going to add false here for Batman. And if you're a Batman fan and you think Batman's overpowered, I apologize, but I would probably consider someone like Superman to be overpowered. But let's go with Batman in this case is a new superhero, right? And this is going to be Bruce, 55, favorite fruit is steak, and false for overpowered. All right. Then what I'd like you to do is log out the prototype change for both Anya and for Batman. Okay. Then I want you to ask, is it possible to call the greet function on Batman, which is a superhero? And note that we added greet to the person prototype, not to the prototype of superhero. Okay. But we did change the prototype of superhero to be person. Right, so can we call the greet function on Batman? And if we can, why or why not? And what are the properties on each of these objects? And can you explain why they're there and how they got there? And the bonus for this, and this is really the key takeaway from this exercise, is did we really just basically re-implement a form of OOP or object-oriented programming? I'd like you to really sit once you've done these exercises or this exercise in particular, and just kind of sit and just look at it and ask yourself, is this just object-oriented programming? Is that what it is, right? It's an interesting question. So give that a shot. Definitely a bit more high level of a question here, and then we'll go through it together. All right, so let's kind of set these up. So we have function person here. I'm going to pull that down here. Then we want to do a, where was it? Person.prototype.greet, right, is equal to this. So I'm just going to copy that down. So we're saying add to the person prototype the greet method, which is this function here, which is going to log out this .name, says hello. Do we know what this is? No, we don't know what this is yet because this is dynamically bound at runtime, and the context is given to us depending on how we actually call greet. Okay, so we've seen that before. Then we want to call a function called superhero that has the same 3 parameters as person, but adds a 4th one called overpowered. So I'm just going to copy person, so I don't retype too much. I'm going to change this to superhero, and I'm going to add overpowered here. And I'm just going to say this dot overpowered is equal to overpowered. All right, there we go. That wasn't too bad. Then what we want to do is we want to set the prototype of superhero to be person. Okay, so this is slightly confusing. So what would be the easiest way to actually do this? Well, there's a couple of things that we can do. And you might have tried this a couple of ways and might have ran into some errors. So I'll show you both ways just so that it makes more sense and you can kind of choose which one that you like more. So we can actually grab superhero.prototype. Now, the way that the prototype property works behind the scenes and the __ proto works behind the scenes is a bit finicky. And in this case of prototype and __ proto, it's actually kind of like a secular reference. So what we need to do is we have to do __ proto of the prototype, not the dot prototype of the prototype, because prototype is only a property on superhero. It is not on the actual prototype itself, right? So if you think of the actual prototype, it looks like this, prototype, right? Which we looked at in the prototype video, and it does not have a prototype key on it. Only things in JavaScript have a prototype key on them, sometimes depending on how they were created, and it's used by the engine to do different things depending on what that prototype says. But the proto property is slightly different, and it points to this prototype object. Technically, so does this, but there's a bit of confusion between the two. But let's just go with this for now instead of getting too caught up in the weeds, because we can get into that in more detail as we go through more examples of this and actually look at OOP as well. So in this case, we're saying, what do we want the prototype of superhero to point to, right? Well, we want to point it to the person's prototype. So person.prototype. Right? So we are saying hook up superhero's prototype to point to person's prototype. Person's prototype is going to point to the object prototype if it's created using the new keyword, and the object prototype is going to point to null. Okay, so once we've done that, let's see if we can create these two instances of both person and superhero. So there's Anya, regular person, and Batman, who is a superhero. Right? And notice that we're using the new keyword for both of these so that we can set up the this context for both person and for superhero. Otherwise, this is not going to exist and will be undefined in the case of not calling new. So let's actually see the next step here, the prototype chain for each of these objects. So I'll show you a slightly different way to actually log out this prototype chain, right? So we've been doing it pretty manually for now. But let's actually just see how we can do this a little bit more automated fashion. Imagine if it's like a super long prototype, right? So I'm going to just call a variable here. I'm going to say let proto equal to anya.__proto. Then I'll say while the prototype is not equal to undefined, so this is a short form for that, I want to console.log out the prototype, right? And then I want to change prototype to be prototype.__proto. Now this looks pretty confusing, but if you really walk through this logic, it should make a bit more sense as to what's actually happening. Let's just make sure this actually works and I didn't mess this up too badly. I'm gonna run node and I'm gonna do bonus exercise 2. And if we do this, what you'll see is that we have the object prototype, and then we have the what is this? The null prototype, I think. So did I do this correctly? Let's see if I should get person and interesting. So I want to actually log out the prototype.constructor.name, just like that. And if we run this again, we'll see that we get person and object. The order of this was a little bit confusing, but I guess, oh, that's what we had first. Okay. Very, very confusing way that this was logged out. I even got confused myself. But we can see that in this case, the prototype for Anya is person. And then we go up to object, and then we can kind of go to null, which is why we don't enter the loop again, because the proto gets set to null and we don't enter this loop again. All right, let's do the same for Batman. So I'll reset the prototype to be Batman.__proto. Right? And I'm just going to kind of redo this loop right here. So let's copy and paste it down here, and let's try that as well. So we're going to get person and object for Anya, but then we're going to get superhero, person, and object for Batman. Very, very interesting, right? So why is this happening? So let's answer this question here, number 7. So like log out the prototypes of each of these objects and maybe do a bit of explanation as to what's happening, right? When we set up the prototype of superhero to be person, we literally did this right here, right? We said go superhero. Superhero is going to inherit from the person prototype, and person prototype is going to inherit from the object prototype. Okay, so that's what we're seeing right here. And that's what is happening when we set it up on line 55. If I get rid of line 55, let's rerun this. And what we'll see is that now superhero is directly a descendant of object because we didn't set its prototype to be person prototype anymore. Okay. Now I'd like to show you this right here. Can I call greet on Batman? So I'm going to do this without setting Batman or superheroes to be a prototype to be the person prototype. Okay, so without the prototype changing, I'm going to see if I can do Batman.greet. Okay, so let's do this, and you can see that we get Batman.greet is not a function. Interesting, right? So why would that be? Well, because if we look at where greet exists, right, greet is a function or a method on the person prototype. We never added this to the superhero prototype. So of course, since Batman is a superhero and not a person, it's not going to find this on the prototype chain, right? But if we set Batman's prototype, or I should say superhero's prototype, to be the person prototype, which indirectly affects Batman's prototype to be the superhero and then the person prototype, let's see what happens. If I run the same code and I bring back my prototype assignment here, what we'll see is Bruce says hello. Check that out. Isn't that awesome, right? So what's happening is that JavaScript is checking, hey, is there a greet on superhero, right? Well, if we look at superhero's prototype, there is no greet on that at all, right? There is no greet in here either, right? So it's not going to find it. So it's going to look up the prototype chain. We've seen that before in the prototypes video. Well, what's the prototype of superhero? Well, we set it to be person, right? So is there a greet on person? That's what we're going to check next. Well, yeah, it's on the person prototype. So we're going to use that, right? And that's why we see Bruce says hello, right? Even though Bruce is a superhero, not just a person. I guess you could say you'd be both in this case, but a special type of person, right? All right, that's pretty cool. So let's take a look at the properties on each of these objects. So I'm just going to do finally here before we discuss object-oriented programming, console.log object.get own property names of what do we have, Anya, and then I'm going to do the same for Batman. And if I do this, what we'll see is that Anya has name, age, and favorite food, which makes sense, right? Because Anya is a person, and person only has name, age, and favorite food. There is no overpowered, right? If you look at favorite person, or not favorite person, person right here, we don't have an overpowered property, right? But if you think about superhero, right, which is what this second log is, right? We're logging out the values for Batman. Well, Batman is a superhero, and superheroes do have an overpowered property, which is why we see that in the property list for Batman, because Batman is a superhero. All right, that is pretty awesome. Now, the real question with all this is, did we just create OOP? Did we just create object-oriented programming? Well, in a sense, we kind of recreated at least some parts of it, right? Technically, we recreated like inheritance, for example, right here, or a form of inheritance, right? We probably created some other small parts of OOP as well, and we'll go through them in the future videos when we look at classes and object-oriented programming in general. But the main thing to keep in mind here is that we are now able to set up custom prototype chains where each link in the chain can add to the parent above it, right? So we are adding to object when we create person, right? So person has all these different things on it, including greet, and we're adding to person when we create a superhero, right? At which, for example, we're having an overpowered property. And we can use any of the methods available to us or the properties available to us inside of person or object when we are using superhero, because all of our parents' prototypes and key value pairs are available to us, which is super awesome, right? Very powerful. Now, I know this was a long video. I purposely created a whole bunch of exercises to get more practice with this, because if we can understand these concepts, it's really going to help us out a lot when it comes to OOP and just prototypical inheritance in general. This is not only in JavaScript, it exists in other languages as well, and really understanding the difference between prototypal inheritance and strict object-oriented programming inheritance is really fundamentally important when it comes to kind of the nuances between the pros and cons between these two types of programming paradigms. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did like these videos, or these exercises, I should say, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments, were you able to get through all these exercises? Was this too long? Did I go a bit overboard with this video? Or were these a good amount of exercises, and did you appreciate the different amount of practice that you could do? Or were my instructions clear enough? I hope they really were. It was a bit tricky to craft these instructions so that they were a bit more general, so you had room to think. I'd also love to see what your thoughts are on this version of prototypes and inheritance and how the this keyword is. Does it all kind of make sense when you put it together in this context? There's so many puns in there. It's quite amazing. The punniness is pretty next level. But I'd really love to hear in the comments what you think about that. And what we're going to do, as I mentioned in the next video, is go through an introduction to classes and object-oriented programming, where we're going to take these concepts, and instead of doing all this manual stuff of setting up the prototypes and figuring out which points to what and all these value pairs and things like that, and weird things like this where we're kind of setting like these, you know, prototype.__proto, like, why am I doing this, right? And like all this prototype stuff here, we can just use the new class syntax in JavaScript to basically automate a lot of this complexity for us and think about things at a much higher level so that we can actually worry about solving problems instead of figuring out how JavaScript works internally behind the scenes. I can't wait to get to OOP and that series of videos that's going to come along with it to wrap up this series. I'll see you over there. See you later.